I'm Mel. This is Book Hunt. What I want to talk about is how books represent gender. I will put a list of all the books I mention in the show notes so that if you're interested in following any of them up or reading any of them, you can. I just rewatched Transtrenders by ContraPoints, which is an excellent video and you should just watch it. But in about 23 minutes, she gets into like what is gender. And there's a discussion about whether it is a performative set of actions, whether it is more amorphous than that, whether it is just construct, whether it is linked in some way to biology, all of the options, basically. And that made me think about my reading, and so I wanted to talk about some books and what they say about gender. The first one, rather than a book, is more of an author. I read quite a bit of Natasha Pulley. I've read all of her books, and Natasha Pulley writes historical fiction, often with a magical element, and a gay romance. The romance is a gay male romance. The last book I read was her most recent, Valerie Kay, and I sort of started to notice a trend that the representation of gender expression between the two men in the relationship actually is starting to show a pattern of binary stereotypes that sort of fall into like male, female, a soft, a hard, a sort of hetero almost mirroring. That's sort of across all of her books. I don't think it's an obvious thing or even necessarily a conscious thing. I suspect what it is Natasha Pulley writing a man as attractive in a way that she responds as a heterosexual woman to men. And so one of her men is quite masculine, and maybe the character that she more relates to is a softer, more feminine. And the way that this comes across in her books is often about things like softness, things like size, things like which is the more dominant physically when there's lovemaking. All of those things. And I think it's both interesting about the author and the book that these dynamics are replicated in her gay characters, and interesting about me that I read that as being masculine and feminine in characters that are, for the most part of these books, cis men. There is an insinuation in her most recent book that one of her characters may be non-binary or even a trans woman, and that gave me thoughts of Daryl. And when Daryl first starts to talk about his own gender, it is a comparison, a juxtaposition against more masculine men, and then it is opposing in the fripperies of female flounciness. But in Daryl, there's an examination by Daryl of the fact that femininity isn't a flouncy dress, but that women don't wear that, and that women wear jeans and t-shirts and hoodies. So I wonder why I was uncomfortable with a similar sort of depiction in the Pulley books. Is it because there was less discussion, or is it because it's written by a hetero woman? I believe a hetero woman. I actually, there's no information on the internet about Natasha Pulley's gender or sexuality. And then I wanted to talk about what I learned from Detransition Baby, which is a lot about the fact that gender doesn't have to be a static relationship. A human that has a static relationship with their gender is probably a human that hasn't questioned it. And as a society, we're super accepting of the idea, well, the part of society that I associate with is super accepting of the idea that you might transition to a different gender. But if you were to detransition, there's this assumption that your initial transition was somehow a mistake. And I want to stop talking about gender for 30 seconds and give you an example. I ran a business for 10 years. In the end, it basically went bankrupt. It failed. But it employed myself and my husband and part of my family. It paid our bills for 10 years. That's a decade. Was it a complete mistake because it failed? Was it a waste of time? Did I do nothing? No one would say any of that is true. They would say that you did something really good for 10 years and in the end it broke and it no longer served you. So you moved on. And if you lived as a woman for 10 years and in the end found that wasn't serving you anymore and moved on and expressed your gender in a different way, that doesn't mean that 10 years as a woman was less valid or true or real. The idea that something must be permanent to have been a valid part of your life is stupid. It's stupid. And this fear that medically transitioning might be a mistake is ridiculous. I mean, do we put the same pressure of permanency on women who want to get breast enhancements or butt lifts? No, we don't, because it's their body and they can do whatever they want with it. And the same is true for medical transition, except that society thinks that big tits is a great idea and being a trans woman isn't a great idea, and society is wrong. It's wrong. Another book that I think shows a journey and a transience and starts to explain, actually, I'm not even going to say a book, I'm just going to say Akwaeke Emezi, in all of their gender representation, demonstrates that gender is a relationship and therefore moving. I think Freshwater is a great example of that, and also The Death of Vivek Oji. I think that the idea that it's a linear progression is a cis idea that has been imposed on the reality of what the relationship with gender non-conforming people go through, and how their gender is developed in different situations, in different contexts, in different parts of their body and their mind, and different ways of expressing that. The other thing that I think that Akwaeke Emezi does really well is explore the multiplicity of gender through Freshwater. I think that particular exploration gives a great feel for people who consider themselves to be gender fluid. People who consider themselves to be gender fluid. I think the idea that multiple ways of feeling exist, I think, like, that makes sense to me. That makes so much sense to me, and the representation of that in Freshwater was really interesting. I really like that Akwaeke Emezi uses very different techniques to represent gender. There's a real basic level of representation of gender through clothing in books like Frog Music and The Master of Jinn. And while I think that this is important and significant and good, it's good to see some diversity in how gender is represented, because being a woman is not just wearing a dress, and being a man is not just wearing a suit, as in Frog Music. And you can see in Frog Music that dressing as a man is not the only masculine characteristic of that character, and you can feel that maybe at the time there wasn't the term for what they felt themselves to be. And in The Master of Jinn, her masculine clothes don't make her any less of a woman. And I think that's a really beautiful representation of gender diversity and gender expression diversity. And juxtaposed with her girlfriend and also her partner by the end of the book, who comes from a different religion, and they all have their different depictions of womanhood, which has a lot of fashion and clothing representation, because that does seem to be a P. Gently Clark fascination. Diversity within genders is also something that I noticed about Ghost War by Sarah Moss, and how we could see the different levels of power within relationships, and how femininity and expression of that femininity was acceptable and non-acceptable to different women who had grown up in different ways. I hope you've enjoyed this little chat. I intend to do a little series of them, but I don't know what to call them. So if you've got any ideas of what these sort of informal book chats that will probably revolve around some kind of theme, if you've got an idea of what to call them, put it in the comments. Otherwise, I'd really like to continue this conversation in the comments, but I will not be discussing whether trans people are valid. I love trans people. There are trans people in my life, and they are absolutely amazing. That is all.